just know that they can hear you online now at this point.
Okay, folks. It's always great to be able to visit with one another, and we love to extend that time. If people really want to step out or need to step out, you can always go into our friendship room next door, but we do want to get started because I know a lot of people are very, very interested in the presentation today. So you can get more food at any time, and I'm going to ask you to kind of settle. And I guess the people who aren't really listening are the people who haven't settled. So, all right. No, we're a friendly community. Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to Patty, and Patty is the chair of one of the committees or teams of the church called the trustees, who manage and care for all the funds that help us be able to do a lot of the programming and that we do here. So I'll pass it on to Patty to introduce also our guest.
Thanks very much, Harris. So as Harris said, my name is Patty Talbot, and I'm currently the chair of the Board of Trustees of the congregation. And I'd like the other trustees who are present in the room to wave your hand, because there are several of us here. All right, so there's Kin, there's Jennifer, there's Brian, there's Peter somewhere. I can't see him. Peter. So there's several of us as trustees who have been elected by the congregation at the annual meeting, and one of our key roles is to steward and monitor the financial and related assets of the congregation. We get good professional help in that role. And when we met with our financial advisor during the summer, we asked him, are there things that we should be attending to? Can you name things that we maybe should be reminded about? And he said, well, make sure that you have good planning resources available to you, the trustees, and to the congregation. And so from that conversation came the idea for this seminar, this estate planning seminar. And so I'm delighted to introduce Riann Botha, who is a senior trust advisor with Solus Trust, which is an affiliate, a wholly owned affiliate of Raymond James, Raymond James Inc., or Raymond James, who also manages or assists us in managing our financial assets. When we talked to our advisor, he said Riann is the one that he would recommend, the best in the city in terms of estate planning. So, Riann, it's wonderful to welcome you here. He's a fellow Jays fan, so he's also kind of getting over last night. Yep. I looked on your LinkedIn profile, Riann, and one of the things noted there was that Riann is guided by the value of stewardship, that is, leaving things better than we found them. He influences others to pay it forward by sharing and transferring knowledge wherever they go. So, Riann, we're delighted to have you here. We're going to have about an hour altogether, not more than an hour. We're going to have time for questions and answer. This is being live streamed as well. So those of you who are on the live stream, please feel free to also send in questions by email to Aaron or to type them into the chat. We want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask any questions or raise comments as you would like. So with that, Riann, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Patty.
Yeah, you need to, is that on?
Is it on? Ah, there we go. It's on. Let me try and move it up. Is it? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. As I said, I'm Riann Botha. I'm one of the senior trust advisors for Solus Trust. Solus Trust is a trust business that looks after the estate administration, incapacity planning, and those kinds of things for clients. As Patty mentioned, I'm definitely not in this for the money. This is for the passion of making sure that people's estates are properly planned and that there's no hassles when somebody passes on. I've been in this industry now for close to 25 years. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I want to make sure that everybody's got an efficient estate plan in place. So if we look at the agenda, so we'll quickly cover some of the estate planning factors in the Canadian landscape, then we'll look at the estate plan, then we'll go into the estate administration process, and then I'll give you an overview a bit of Raymond James and Solus Trust and how we can be of assistance. And if there's any questions throughout, I don't like to do death by PowerPoint. Ask any questions at any stage. So if we look at the Canadian landscape, it is actually November is Make-A-Will month in Canada. So if we look at the stats, about 55% of Canadians have a will and have powers of attorney. For Canadians under the age of 35, that drops to about 22%. And that's why I say it's important for us to plant the seed and make sure you've got a basic document such as a will in place. A will is that final document that dictates what's going to happen to your estate, what should happen to your kids, etc. upon your passing. And if that document's not in place, then legislation is going to determine how the estate will be handled. And I cannot think of any person that do not want to have the final say of what happens to them, their assets, and their beneficiaries. So if we look at estate planning, some of the major objectives of estate planning should be to minimize taxes, maximize the inheritance value, ensuring the lost person's, the wishes of the person is met, minimize legal expenses, and simplify the settlement of the estate. Just give me 1 second, trying to make this a bit bigger. So if we look at some of the factors there, so minimizing taxes upon death. So remember, in the Canadian landscape, if you pass on, there's a deemed disposition on your assets the day you pass on. Then the CRA would come and take their piece of the pie. Assets that's excluded from paying capital gains tax as your principal residence and certain other assets. But if there's, for instance, funds remaining in a retirement fund, then that full amount will be included in your final taxes for income taxes. So as part of the bigger estate planning process, it is making sure that documentation is in place, as well as looking that there's sufficient liquidity within the estate to settle the estate. We can look at some jointly owned assets. Remember, upon your passing, any jointly owned assets automatically transfers across to the joint owner. And then one of the major things that we look at nowadays is family dynamics. As I said, I've been in this industry long enough to have seen where the smallest item becomes the biggest contention for fighting. I've been fortunate in my career to work on estates and trusts of $100,000, and the biggest estate that I did was close to $8 billion US. And trust me, in every single one of those cases, if there is an asset of high sentimental value that has not been discussed on what should happen to that when the person passes on, it becomes the center of potential family breakup. If we look at the Canadian landscape, one of those assets is potentially a cottage. Cottage normally becomes that thing where it's been in the family forever and a day, and now you've got 3 or 4 kids that now need to decide what's going to happen to that. I'm a firm believer in having the estate planning discussion with your kids. They need to understand who's going to be acting in what capacity, who's going to be inheriting what, and how that's going to be distributed to them. A typical example is you've got the opportunity to say in your will that certain assets must be held in trust for the benefit of any beneficiaries. So it will then be protected from a spendthrift beneficiary, or if kids are under a certain age, you can dictate that the assets must be held in trust for their benefit, to be able to not dictate from the grave, but to provide some guidance from the grave on how to better handle inheriting a sum of money. Does not need to be a large sum of money. Remember, if somebody is inheriting money that has never had any wealth in their life, it is sometimes very difficult to manage that effectively. We can look at charitable giving as an angle to see how you can incorporate charitable giving into your legacy planning, and that can also bring a tax benefit if there's significant gains in the estate. And then support obligations. If you've got support obligations for a beneficiary or family member, then you need to incorporate that into your estate plan to ensure that it continues paying those support obligations upon your passing. There's various ways, as I said, and we'll touch on that a bit later, on what you can do to potentially minimize taxes upon death. But again, we need to see that we start at the beginning of making sure that a proper estate plan is in place. If we go into the executor, so this is one of those jobs where a lot of people act without applying to act in a specific job. It is a job where most of the time, if I ask an individual if they have acted as an executor before, if they'll do it again, 95% of the time, people say no. Hence the bald head. As I said, I've been in this industry long enough where it is, if you have the ability to appoint a professional to take that potential burden away from family or friends, I would definitely suggest that. Yes, there's a fee attached to that gets paid out of the estate, but trust me, avoiding potential family conflict or potential liability is worth the money. Okay, so some of the factors that we need to look at when deciding who you want to appoint as the executor. First one is time. I'm just going to jump to this slide quickly. It shows there that it takes on average about 570 hours of effort over a period of 16 to 18 months to settle an estate. If we look at probate, so probate is where you take the final will that was done by a person, that is given to court together with all the list of assets and liabilities in the estate, and the court rubber stamps that will to say, this is the final will, and that's the person that's then been appointed as the executor. That person can then utilize that in order to transfer across certain assets. There's some assets that do not need to go through probate, but I'll go into a bit more detail on that next. Second one is age. Preferably do not want to appoint somebody that is of a similar or older age than you. Canada has got an aging landscape, and we need to ensure that people acting in this capacity will potentially outlive you, and if they are not going to outlive you, that you then have a backup to be able to step into your shoes. Third one is knowledge. This is an ever-changing industry. If the person acting in this capacity does not have the knowledge to do what is needed, then number 6, personal liability comes in. A good example of that is there was a case not too long ago where the beneficiaries of an estate was a niece, nephew, and a charity, and one of the assets in the estate was that famous cottage. The executor in this estate decided to give the niece and nephew access to the cottage for the last time before they put it on the market to be sold. Never discussed this with the charity. The value of the cottage actually went down by about $100,000 in value since date of death until they sold the cottage, and the executor was sued by the charity for that reduction in value and was successful in their claim. Remember, so charities also want money. If they are promised an inheritance or a bequest out of an estate, they want to make sure they get that as well. Next one is executor location. Canada is a country of immigrants. So a lot of the times what happens is people appoint a family member that might not be a Canadian resident as the executor. Together with that, there are potential tax implications and other administrative implications. So make sure that when you appoint a person as your executor, that preferably that person is within the borders of Canada and even within the same province to avoid any additional conflict. Assets outside of jurisdiction. If there are any assets outside of Canada, then we need to look at what's the best possible estate plan that you can look at. So potentially having a Canadian will and then will for separate assets outside of the borders of Canada. Again, looking at the complexity of the estate will determine that. This is just a snapshot of some of the functions that the executor will have to do. I think there's 118 different steps. Doesn't matter how big or how small the estate is, that the executor will need to do. Again, that's why I say if you are appointed as executor for somebody else or thinking of who you're going to be appointing as the executor over your estate, I'm the lawyer in the family, so everybody appointed me as executor, and then slowly but surely I went and said, guys, I've got a full-time job. I do not have the time to handle this when time comes. So all family and friends, in my case, I've converted to a professional executor to take that over. Because that is what we do as a trust company. It's all we do, is manage estates and incapacity situations where we're acting as power of attorney for property. It speeds up the estate administration process as well as then avoids any potential conflict and liability. So if we go into the estate administration process, so first steps would be to find and review the will. This is one of those documents that if you do not have the original, you potentially do not have anything. So make sure, firstly, you've got a will. Secondly, know where the original will is. One thing that recently popped up is if you store your will in a safety deposit box. In order to get access to the safety deposit box, you need probate. In order to get probate, you need the original will. So it's a catch-22. So again, look at those small little things. Then you collect and review all the important documents pertaining to the estate, make funeral arrangement, contact all the beneficiaries, and then freeze and cancel or redirect all financial and service accounts. So this is one of those topics where people do not, for instance, have enough liquidity to still cover the expenses pertaining to a house. As I mentioned earlier, probate in Toronto, currently anywhere from 4 to 11 months before we get probate. So for that 11 months, if there's real estate that forms part of the estate, that cannot be sold. So that would still have to be maintained until probate has been received and gives the executor the authority then to sell the property. Redirecting mail, and then assess immediate needs of dependents, pets, and other assets. After that, you need to ensure that all assets are protected, and then proper accounting gets done. So, as I said, the first obligation would be to locate the will, and if you do not have a will, I had a case about 4 weeks ago where I reviewed the original will of a client in 2022. Client passed away 4 months ago, and the family cannot find the original will now. In this case, they are lucky because it's 2 kids that's the only beneficiaries in terms of the estate. So if they cannot find the original will, it will then be distributed in terms of interstate, and this will then cover that. So a good example of when a person dies without a will. So here's an example. Person died without a will with 2 children and a spouse, and let's say the total value of the estates is $3 million. The spouse would receive the first $350,000. Remaining $2.65 million will then be divided with $1.325 to be divided equally amongst the children, and $1.325 million going to the spouse. Remember, this is all assets that is not jointly held potentially between spouses. If it's jointly held, then it automatically goes across to that person. Common law spouses are not included. Yes?
Only when a person dies intestate that a will has to go to probate, is that correct?
So a will has to go to probate if there's assets that need to go through probate. So assets that, for instance, do not need to go through probate. So if you've got shareholding in a corporation, those assets to transfer it across to beneficiaries do not need to go through probate. But there's a dual will planning. So you can have a primary will and a secondary will. Primary will is assets that need to go through probate. Secondary will, assets that do not need to go through probate. If you do not have a will at all, then you need to go through probate, because somebody needs to be formally appointed as the estate trustee or executor to then handle the administration of the estate. Okay, so, and then if we look at common law spouses, I'm currently dealing with a case where a couple has been together for 43 years. In beginning of 2023, I saw them to discuss their estate plan. They postponed. And remember, this is one of those things that's on top of the procrastination list. And they never got wills in place. The estate in this case is about $8.5 million that the wife held. She unfortunately passed away with no will. The common law husband has no claim to the inheritance. He's now instituting a dependence relief claim. The closest next of kin are 2 cousins that last time they spoke to them was 35 years ago. Those 2 cousins are now appointed as the executors and the primary beneficiaries of the estate. So this is going to be a lengthy process in order, firstly, to get probate, because we're still struggling to get probate, and then secondly, to distribute the estate, because he's going to institute a hopefully full dependence relief claim to the full amount. But again, this could have easily been avoided if a simple will was in place. And that's why I say, start with the basics. Then making funeral arrangements. So remember, yes. Okay. So making funeral arrangements. Again, remember, that's the job of the executor, unless otherwise specified in any documentation, to then make the funeral arrangements. I did a presentation this week to the Ontario Funeral Association, which is all the owners of all the funeral houses in Ontario. And it is a situation that they also need guiding documents to let them know what's going to happen to the person's remains, what's going to happen pertaining to the arrangements on the funeral, etc. So again, it just shows you how a simple document such as a will is important as part of it. Yes?
So before you answer, we just would like to repeat the question for the folks online. And I think you were saying, do you recommend getting a simple will kit and consulting a lawyer? I'm sorry, my attention, versus...
In the last few years, it's come up, these different companies offer these will kits, or banks or different places offer it. And is that better or better than nothing? Or
Not the more money, the more complex your estate is. So yes, again, I'm fine with online will platforms. It is a step-by-step process that you go through that asks you various questions to then spit out the legal document. It's designed by lawyers. So if you've got a simple, straightforward estate where everything is going to go directly to the kids, there's no additional planning, then that's sufficient. But if there's any more complications, then I would suggest to get a lawyer involved to look at the bigger picture. Because it can easily happen that beneficiary designations on registered plans or pension or life insurance is not thought of as part of the own drafting of your will. And then it can potentially cause conflict when the estate gets divided. Okay.
Follow-up
Yes.
question? Yep, I'm just going to get the mic to you. Yep.
So I have a daughter who lives in Montreal. You said something about if the person is out of preferably something in the same province.
In province, yeah.
So I know in life insurance and insurance, Quebec has a whole different set of laws. Is it the same with this? If I was to joint own a condo or property with her that we buy for her, is there ramifications because she's...
No, that's fine. So it is, if it's jointly held with her, then it shouldn't be an issue, or beneficiary designation. As it, if you look at the Quebec laws, there are certain intricacies that's different from most of the other common law provinces. So again, depending on where assets are situated and where beneficiaries are situated, we need to make sure that there's proper planning in those situations. And that's why I would recommend in those situations, go to a legal specialist to be able to assist you in putting the documents in place. If we look at this, as said, when it happens, I would definitely recommend to look at soliciting professional counsel. Do not feel that if you're appointed as executor and now start acting, that you are by yourself on this. There are sufficient support out there to be able to assist you in making sure things are done correctly. Because it can easily become an issue that you do something incorrectly. Let's say, for instance, you distribute assets to beneficiaries and then later found out there's additional tax implications that need to be covered. Remember, then I go back to my personal liability, then potential executor personal liability comes in if the executor cannot get the funds back in order to pay for the outstanding taxes. Next one is notifying the beneficiaries and others. Remember, this is an administrative job. If you act in this capacity, you need to communicate as efficiently as possible to the beneficiaries. If there's a lot of times in the estate administration process where nothing happens. Let's say, for instance, until we've acquired probate, there's minimal things that happen until that stage. We protect the assets, etc. But if you're a beneficiary of an estate and there's 4 months or 5 months and nothing, no communication comes from the executor, that's when you start to think something fishy is happening. So if you're ever appointed in that position, make sure you properly communicate to the beneficiaries and you clearly distinguish what is your role, and you can then provide them with a detailed inventory of the estate. Then, as I said, what we need to look at is doing a complete inventory of the estate. That is real estate, investment accounts, bank accounts, pension, items in the house. Because as I said, it normally is a situation where the sentimental item in the house, if that is taken by one of the beneficiaries, but the intent was for it to in actual fact go to somebody else, that's when the family split up happens. And again, I want to educate and make sure that we have those discussions to avoid those situations as much as possible. Then we go, once you've got all the information pertaining to the estate assets, who the beneficiaries are, let's say there is a will in this case, then you prepare the information to hand into the court for probate. So as I mentioned earlier, assets included for probate is non-registered stocks, bonds, mutual bonds, real estate, jewelry, automobiles, RSP, roofs, and then life insurance policies payable to the estate. So where a beneficiary is not included. Excluded assets or mortgages of real estate, RSPs, roofs, and insurance where you've got designated beneficiary on, and jointly held assets. One question that pops up at least once a week when I have discussions with clients pertaining to estate planning is, I want to appoint my kid as joint on my bank accounts or on my real estate in order to avoid probate. I see probate as mitigating risk. Do not try and avoid probate to save a few dollars. Because remember, that's often where fraud pops in, or cases where people start acting in capacities or distributing assets without having the authority. There are ways in reducing probate tax implications, because it is, if you've got a significant estate and not a lot of liquidity in the estate, let's say you've got a house that you inherited that was worth $1 million, and in the Canadian market, that property went up to $4 million in value. To take that $4 million property through probate at 1.5% is a significant expense that will have to be paid out of the estate. And if you have the capability of removing that as a probatable asset, then we can look at options. But again, we need to look at cost versus benefit. Because one way of potentially taking that asset out of the estate for probate is set up what they call a bear trust. So bear trust is you distinguish between real ownership and beneficial ownership, where you transfer the property into a bear trust for somebody to hold, and then upon your passing, distribute that to the beneficiaries without it having to go through probate. But as of last year, there's additional tax implications on that. Yes.
I've got an interesting one for you. This happened a number of years ago, where my wife and two other ladies were given sentimental items from an estate by this elderly woman. She had to go into a home, and I won't name the trust company, but it's a well-known trust company, went in and removed all of the furniture and put the house up for sale. Now, we happened to find out about that through a neighbor. So we went over, and they said, oh, well, all this material will be dealt with. And my wife said, but there's items in here that are, named on for those items in the will. And they said, oh, but she's not dead yet. True. Anyway, the items from the house were all presumably put in place by Royal Trust. Sorry, but in any event, none of the ladies ever got those items. After she died, all these sentimental items somehow just disappeared.
Prior to joining Solus Trust, I worked in Barbados in the offshore space, helping ultra-high net worth clients reduce their tax implications by putting it in a low-tax jurisdiction. And prior to that, I headed up the Barclays Bank trust business out of South Africa, looking after 13 different countries. When I came to Canada, the perception of Canadian trust companies is not good, and those kinds of stories do not make it easier for us. I'm always of the opinion that service should be our primary focus. It is, if we look at Solus Trust, because we're wholly owned by Raymond James, our aim is not to become this big bad trust company to make a lot of money, but to educate and work with our advisors to be able to provide our clients with a full holistic wealth management offering. But contrary to that, you can have situations where family is appointed as executors or power of attorney for property, and some of those assets go missing. If it's a trust company, there's sufficient, or touch wood, sufficient insurance to cover those situations where neglect or other things happen in the process. So in that case, there should have been next steps in order for the beneficiaries to put a claim in against the estate, but happy to assist if there's still an option. Okay. No. Yep. Yes. No.
Right behind you, behind
Yep.
you.
Something similar like that happened to my mom when she was in a nursing home. Is there steps a person can take before their parents pass but have to go into a nursing home? Maybe they have Alzheimer's or something. Something they can do with the trust to protect things like their wedding jewelry and stuff that goes missing in the home?
You can do as much as you can, but if somebody gets in there, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to control it. What we try and do in every case when we're starting to act in that capacity is appoint a property manager and do an inventory as quickly as possible, and do not let anybody get access to the property. Yes, family members need to potentially get into the property to do certain things, but what we try and do in those situations is be with them when they enter the property, that certain items do not go missing. I had a client in South Africa, I would never forget her, Mrs. Betty Weiss. She was a Holocaust survivor, and this was when I was still practicing as a lawyer. And she'll phone me and say, I need to update my will. And then I'll go to her and we'll update it at least once every 3 months. No family, no big friends. She gave her estate to neighbors and her doctors. And then she would have a fight with the neighbor and take the neighbor's name off the estate. And because it becomes such a regular reoccurrence that we needed to update the will, later on what she did is she took Post-its and placed it on the back of very expensive artwork. The day Mrs. Betty Weiss passed away, there was a line of 15 people standing outside her front door, and everybody ran in to see whose name was behind which painting. And that's why I say it is administering the estate is not merely a financial job that you're doing. There is a human aspect to this that you need to effectively manage. And then if you are having those discussions that the beneficiaries know exactly what is going on or what's going to happen, then you avoid potential conflict. This is just a calculation just to show you if an estate value is $2 million. So remember, the first $50,000 is excluded from probate taxes. On the remaining $1.95 million, you pay 1.5% probate taxes, which is $29,250, which is a lot of money if it is purely a piece of real estate that forms part of the estate that will potentially go outright to a beneficiary and not even be sold. Then the beneficiary is going to have to fork up potential probate fees for it to go through probate. I discussed this earlier where certain assets do not need to go through probate. And then advertising for creditors. So remember, as part of the estate administration process, you need to advertise to see if there are any creditors. So it needs to be 3 consecutive weeks in a local daily newspaper, because that avoids a situation where 10 years down the line, somebody comes and say, you know what, your dad owed me $50,000 and I was never notified that he passed away. If it can be shown that you advertised for creditors, then it makes it easier to defend that claim. So if we look at paying the, yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I feel like you may be just getting into this topic, but there is a question online.
Yes.
And it says, what about ongoing expenses and the need for money after the death, and there's no one to write checks on the bank account?
So once we, for instance, get appointed as executor, one of the first things that we do is we open up an estate bank account. That estate bank account is then utilized in order to pay all expenses pertaining to the estate. But again, there needs to be liquidity in order to fund that. So what often happens is the beneficiaries have to cover those expenses until we've received, or the executor have received probate, to then at a later stage put a claim back into the estate for the expenses incurred. What a lot of people nowadays do is they either put kids joint on an investment account or a specific bank account to be utilized for that. Because it's a lot of money to maintain a house. Let's say the kids do not stay in Toronto anymore. Now there's a house that needs to be looked after that somebody has to pay, but if there's no access to cash, it becomes a bit of a problem.
And I'm just adding this, I imagine if there is somebody who's acting as an executor out of town, providing funds for them to travel might also be a good action to think about in advance, yes.
I'm currently dealing with a case where this sad. We updated the estate plan for the clients end of July. End of July 23rd, we signed the new wills for husband and wife. Husband has had 6 strokes over the last 4 years. We were thinking that he's going to pass away first, and then 2 weeks ago, the wife passed away. Husband, the kids, one kid stays in London, UK. The other kid stays in Vancouver. Both of them had to now fly in. The costs of them coming here has to be covered by the estate. We are now acting as the executor of the wife's estate, as well as acting as the power of attorney for property for the husband, because he does not have the ability to handle this. And it's now a waiting game for him to then pass away, for the assets then to be distributed to the kids as the beneficiaries. So nobody's got that crystal ball to know when you're going to be passing away, and that's why it's important to do this planning. I know it's a morbid discussion, but it's one of those death and taxes, we cannot avoid it. If you do not have a proper plan in place, then there's significant issues that you're going to have to face. Okay, so again, looking at...
Can I have a question on that very topic? When I was the last executor for my cousin in 2017, and I only charged 4%, by the way, as an executor's fee, but I was told by my lawyer, that's it, that's your 4%. The fact I had to travel to Windsor, back and forth, get the house sold and so on, accommodations, travel, gasoline expenses, not covered.
Yep.
My fee, fine, but that was it.
Yeah. So again, to that point, remember, this is a job where a professional and an amateur can charge the same fee. So in Ontario, an executor can charge up to 5% executor's fee. I saw an article today about Royal Trust where people made comment that if they appoint their executor, their lawyer as their executor, they will potentially pay, the estate will potentially pay less in expenses compared to a trust company. I'm a lawyer. Lawyer charges per hour, and if you look at the fees that they will gather over the 18 months while administering the estate, it can potentially be more than the 2, 3, 4, or 5% that we will charge as the trust company acting in that capacity. We will never, I think our highest fee that we would charge as an executor is just under 4%. So we'll never get close to 5%. I've had cases where 4 siblings are the beneficiaries of an estate. One sibling is acting as the executor and has charged a full 5% executor's fees on estate, $480,000 in fees as acting as an executor. In those cases, what needs to happen is all the beneficiaries need to agree to it if there's no other wording in the will pertaining to the fees that the executor can take. So again, if we look at the process pertaining to the distribution of the estate, so filing the final tax return and obtaining the CRA clearance certificate is crucial. CRA clearance certificate is only obtained once all final taxes have been paid and the CRA says, thank you, this estate has now been completely closed and you can distribute the final assets to the beneficiaries. There's an executor, an advisor at one of our offices. He acted as executor for his uncle's estate 23 years ago. One of the assets that was still in the estate was a share in a golf course here in Toronto where he was a member at, that was sold, and now the estate got an additional $165,000 on the sale of the golf course. In this case, we had to now reopen the estate and then pay two beneficiaries that we needed to locate, not a single one being in Canada anymore. I think 60 or 65% of the beneficiaries have since predeceased, and all the other beneficiaries are in Italy. So it's now costing the estate nearly $45,000 already in fees trying to locate the beneficiaries in order to distribute $100,000 to them. Yes.
A practical question, and it's not hypothetical in my case, where you have, per the first point, estate assets being distributed, where you have somebody who's in temporary housing, say a retirement home, and has to exit, what does an executor do?
So in those cases, remember, we need to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. So we will take a snapshot to see what the value at date of death is, and then look at the composition of the estate to determine how that should be handled. It is, yes.
I was thinking of physical, sentimental assets more than the others, which
So,
also need to be protected, right?
Agree. So now you sit with a situation where physical items need to be stored somewhere at a cost before it can be distributed. We're dealing with a case where a client passed away in Mississauga, where there's a car, there's no family in Canada. That car, the value of the car is $16,000. Person passed away in June. The cost of storage is going to end up being $12,800 by December. So practicality is important in this process. So we need to make sure from a planning perspective, what can we do to avoid a situation where cost versus benefit is completely skewed? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
What is the typical amount of time for a clearance certificate from the CRA in these cases?
Once we've done the final notice of assessment, 6 to 8 months to get a clearance certificate. So remember, there's a lot of things after COVID that is taking a lot longer. There's been cuts on various sides pertaining to government positions that is now causing things to take a lot longer. And that's why it is critical to be 2 steps ahead. An estate plan is never cast in stone. It should change as and when things change during your life, as well as circumstances around you. Okay, then we distribute the assets to the beneficiaries. So assets, firstly, is cash legacy. So if you bequeath a specific item or cash to a beneficiary, they get the item first. Secondly, you can provide for trusts. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if any assets need to be protected for the benefit of beneficiaries. And then after that, the residue, after all taxes, liabilities, etc., have been settled, then the residue is paid out to the beneficiaries. Yes?
I just had a question about, say you had a business that was creating a passive residual income and your child wasn't involved in it, but they would be the inheritor of that income. So you'd put those kind of things in place too in the
secondary will. So potentially if you have that, you've got a secondary will that those assets can then go and be held in trust for the benefit of the minor beneficiary. So if somebody else is still managing the business and there's continual income coming from that, then that can be paid into the trust and on a monthly, quarterly, annually basis be distributed to the beneficiary, again, depending on how the wording of the trust is. So again, remember, when somebody dies, life carries on. And liabilities and income, a lot of the time, do not cease. You need to do proper planning of what should happen to those assets and those liabilities when you're not around anymore. I've had situations where new spouse now inherits a share in a family business where the ex-spouse is involved in. And trust me, that gets interesting. Because they never sat around the same table, and now they need to run a business together. So, and again, that was because of bad planning. You need to ensure that better planning's in place. Yes?
So if it's a child and they weren't active, you have to have that conversation with them about what's in the trust, but also maybe train them about how
And
to
that's
run it.
why I believe there's a clear distinction between a guardian, which is the best parent for your kids if they're still minor kids, versus a trustee, which is the financial manager. Does not need to be the same person, but it gives you that ability to clearly choose the person that you're going to see as the best parent versus financial manager. Because it often happens that the family member that you think is going to be able to step into your shoes the best to be a parent cannot manage funds at all. So to have independence pertaining to decision-making on the finance side would then be beneficial to consider a trust company, for instance, acting in that capacity. Okay. Again, this is risk mitigation has become the new word in the 21st century, because you need to ensure that what you've done is properly recorded, that if anybody should ever challenge that you've got the documentation to prove that. So have a checklist. I'll send Patty some documentation that she can distribute. Have proper documentation in place if you're acting as the executor to make sure that what you've done adequately. You don't want anybody to challenge what you've done down the line. And then if we look at the estate accounting, I'm going to quickly go through this. So remember, there's a difference between capital distribution and income distribution. So if you, for instance, state that any capital be held in trust for the benefit of a minor beneficiary until the age of X, then we can distribute the income that's generated, for instance, out of an investment portfolio or a business to the beneficiary, or it can be accumulated within the trust until an X age. What I often advise clients is if you have beneficiaries that you would want them to have access to the capital at, let's say, at the age of 35, give the trustee the discretion to make additional capital distributions. Because it might be a situation where the beneficiary is 30 or 34 years old, and it's the perfect time to then use capital to buy a house. If the trustee does not have the discretion to make bigger capital distributions, then the estate or that beneficiary cannot get access to that. I'm going to jump through this. As I mentioned earlier, first thing, what you need to do is looking at opening up an estate bank account. So this is a new bank account that's opened in the name of the estate that will then avoid a situation where the person acting as the executor and the executor's accounts are not commingled. Because often what happens is there's a hydro bill that needs to be paid, there's not enough cash this month in the estate, then the person utilizes their own fee income to be able to settle that. It then becomes a problem both from a legal perspective and potentially tax perspective. So having the bank account is critical as part of that. As I mentioned earlier, if we look at the executor liability, executors may be personally liable to the beneficiaries, debtors, and third-party service providers. And then if we look at the example that I gave on the cottage, so loss in value of the estate, unpaid debts, payment on contracts, legal fees, unallowable estate expenses, it pops up more and more nowadays. We unfortunately have a rise in estate litigation going on, and that's twofold. It is either bad planning or the person acting as the executor does not know what they're doing, and then the family starts fighting because of that. So preparing your executor, keep estate documents updated, understand the structure of your assets, consider your choice of executor carefully, keep and update estate information. So if you've got an integrated will memo stating what should happen to personal items, constantly update that. If your will, for instance, mentions that personal items will be divided according to a will memo, it's a document that you can update at your own leisure without having to update your will, so less legal fees, etc. Keep that updated. Digital inventory, remember also times have changed. We've all got digital assets. And if you do not provide the executor the ability to handle digital assets, it can potentially become a problem. Because remember, a digital account might be on your phone, but the location of the ownership might be in California. And if you do not give your executor access to handle that, then it can become a lengthy process to distribute the estate. I'm going to hand over.
You've done this presentation before, I can tell. Because when I saw it on Thursday, I thought, are we going to be there for 2 hours or 3 hours? But you whizzed through it very quickly, so I'll acknowledge that. What I wanted to do, and do I need to get over a bit more to be? Yes, I'll do that. So I can go over here, because I don't want to trip and wipe out your computer. But what I wanted to do here, and you'll see that this is called Future Legacy Gifts for the Church, and sometimes coincidence is great. So we celebrated the anniversary today. And think about the legacy that we're inheriting from those who came before us. From Melrose Park, where I will tell you I was baptized. My parents were married there. My mother was delighted when the Melrose Park people came over because she really liked them. So that was good. But we have legacies. And one of the things you can do in estate planning is think about the legacy, and in this instance, financial legacy, that you choose to give to the church. Now, when I say church, I'm talking a couple of things. I'm talking here at Armour Heights, or you may choose to give something to the Presbyterian Church in Canada because you can give money through World Service and Development or for certain ministries. But think of it as the church, and I'm now going to kind of preface around the congregation of Armour Heights. So there's a couple of ways that this can be achieved. You don't need to take a lot of notes because you're going to get a link that has a 16-page booklet in really large 24-point font, easy to read, that the Presbyterian Church in Canada has prepared that kind of summarizes the first four things that are there on this document. So one way to do this is that if you are 60 years and older, so I'll put my hand up, and you want to make a donation or purchase an annuity in an amount of greater than $10,000, there's a structured program where you can purchase that annuity. A portion of that annuity, that $10,000 or more that you pay, will be a charitable donation in the year you purchase the annuity. For the rest of your life, you will receive some income, and so it all is dependent upon each contract and the initial amount. But at the end of the time when you're with us, and then you pass on, the leftover portion of that annuity then will go to who you designate. So let's say Armor Heights would get a leftover amount from that. So it's one way to structure a donation and a contribution upon death to Armor Heights. Another way is through life insurance. I'm 66 years old, so of course they bought the $5,000 policy way back in 1960. It's there, but it really isn't a big part of my life insurance planning for those around me. So I could choose to have that on my death go as a donation to Armor Heights. And I put there that it can be a new policy or an existing policy. There's various ways to structure that. But life insurance is another way to leave a legacy upon passing to the church. Registered plans. You touched, I think, on beneficiaries
Yep.
and the importance. There are ways you can leave funds from an RRSP, a TFSA, or a registered investment fund. So the registered retirement savings plan, there's lots of lingo here, but registered retirement income fund or a tax-free savings account. And some of that can be passed through to the church of what's there. What I will say is any of those may have some income tax implications to you currently or in the future. So I would suggest if you're pursuing this, you'd want to speak to advisors on the implications of that. There's the stewardship office at the Presbyterian Church in Canada where they track these things, but in all likelihood it's seeking advice from a lawyer or a tax specialist and making sure that you haven't created adverse tax consequences where your wishes aren't being carried out. The last is in a will, and that's a simple one. We do periodically get receipts as the trustees for Armor Heights where somebody who has had an association with the church chooses to leave us $5,000, $10,000, and we collect that through the will, and that's a process that takes a bit of time. We get told you're going to get the money, and then we wait for 6 to 24 months until things go through probate, etc. So a will is another way. The last one that I have, and because we're talking about legacy, is just a reminder that here at Armor Heights, we have the Memorial Fund, and the Memorial Fund is built up by people who choose to provide donations during their lifetime. Let's focus on lifetime now rather than after death to us, and those memorial funds help to pay for the activities and operations within this congregation. And so that's why it says it's not applicable. It's not after death, but this is as you are putting plans together to think about making a legacy donation or a legacy fund to the Memorial Fund. And you can do that in cash, or you can do it in publicly traded securities. And the reason we sort of, every February we come and we remind you can do this, so I'm going to do it in November, and we're going to do it again in February. But the capital markets have performed extremely well this year. Any index you look at, we're up 15 to 23%, just depends upon what's there. The tax advantage that the government of Canada has created is that if you choose to donate the securities that have been held for a period of time, rather than selling them and paying cash, is that the gain that would be taxed in your personal income tax return disappears. So in other words, let's say you bought something for $10,000, it's now worth $20,000, there's a gain of $10,000 there, and then the taxable portion of that is half, and so, and you would pay tax on the disposal at $20,000. If you give the securities to the church, that full $20,000 comes over, and there isn't that triggered taxable capital gain, it goes to zero. So the after-tax cost of giving to the church actually is quite lower. And so that's another option. And because the markets are in great shape, maybe a good time to think about that if you were thinking you wanted to make some sort of donation to the Memorial Fund. And Aaron knows how to do this, and others of us within the church know how to make these contributions through securities or cash. So that was all I wanted to do, was raise the awareness. You will get a link for a 16-page booklet, and also a link to the rest of the documents that are on the Presbyterian Church in Canada. website. There's a webinar there that helps you to think about some of these in the context of the church. And then lastly, there's the book. I've seen many versions of books on organizing your financial affairs. My best advice is pick one of them and actually fill it out. It's amazing how complicated one's life can be when you start to have to think about all the pieces that an executor has to think about. But there will be one that the Presbyterian Church in Canada has as well. And as I say, I'm not concerned which one you use, but please use one of them. So with that, are there any questions? Aaron.
Actually, it's more a statement. Ooh, wow. So I just wanted to, there was a question about handouts and availability of this presentation afterwards. So yes, the good thing is the presentation will be available and we will send it out in an e-blast at some point this week, maybe Thursday and Sunday. So you can look out for that. I know there was a lot of information. People were taking camera pictures of the slides, so this will give you the opportunity to review or maybe send this to someone you love just to inform them how to take care of you, how to take care of the people you love around you. And if you need paper copies of anything, you can just let us know and we can get that if digital is not the best for you to be able to keep track of all of this information. And now I think Patty will.
Yeah, I'm going to say, why don't we take just 5 minutes? I'm aware we're at the 1 hour mark or just slightly over, and people, this is Sunday for Riann as well, but I'm just thinking, let's just take 5 minutes for a couple of short questions, maybe not too involved ones. Riann may be willing to stay for 10 or 15 minutes afterwards. And then we would close. So let's just take, if people have a couple of questions, and then we'll bring the full part to a close and people can stay around as they wish.
Just a quick question. You mentioned you have to have the original will. My original will is at the lawyer's office, but I've given the executives copies of that. Do they need to then get hold of the original, or can they work?
So, as part of the process, the lawyer will potentially do the probate application when that time comes. That's why the lawyer keeps the original will to then hand in at the court to do the probate application. So there's no need for the beneficiaries to have the original will. Probate, in order to get probate, you need the original will. And if the lawyer that's safekeeping that has the will and is going to do the probate application, then they can keep the original.
But the lawyer's not going to do that. The executors will be doing that.
Yeah, so the executors will handle the estate administration process. Somebody still needs to do the probate application, and in the majority of the time, that will be a lawyer that the executor then appoints to do that.
Okay, thank you.
So you'll see, I'm actually going to go there. So as part of our service, in the middle of that will bank, we do offer the services of keeping wills in safe custody as well. Because as I mentioned, if you do not have that original will, then it can potentially become a problem. What I've often seen also is people walk a path with a lawyer stops practicing, and then things just crumble and nobody can find the original documents. Touch wood, hopefully with us, because we're a company, we will never die. If we cease to exist, we will be bought up by somebody else, and we've done that. So we were actually called Raymond James Trust, and we bought Solus Trust, and now I've taken over the will bank of all the wills that clients have signed up with Solus Trust. So somebody will always then act in that capacity as a corporate executor. So again, small intricacies such as that, you need to look at where the original is stored.
It may be a bit too technical, but I noticed your last box on the slide, I think, addresses this, my question. Does Solus have the ability to receive donations with a direction to distribute to several charities? Yep. The problem with giving individual donations of securities is I give 10 shares to this here and I give 10 shares to the Red Cross. Could I give all of my shares to Solus Trust and then the designation that 10% of it goes to the church, 10% of it goes to the Red Cross, etc.?
So we've got the ability to set up a charitable giving fund. So a charitable giving fund is a cheaper way to do your own private foundation. So if you've got various charities that you want to benefit out of your estate, you can direct in terms of your will that the executor then needs to set up a charitable giving fund. In that, you've got a letter of wishes to say the following charities should be the beneficiaries of that charitable giving fund, and we will grant the benefits out of that to those charities as determined by your letter of wishes. Whether you go that route or a long list of charities, we're able to handle both.
And what typically are the fees for managing a
So
charitable
typical
giving fund?
fees for managing a charitable giving fund is about 1% per year. So you've got the capability to set up a charitable giving fund during your lifetime or as a legacy as part of your will planning. So during your lifetime, if you set up a charitable giving fund and you transfer across assets to that, you get the tax credit for that, and you can then see how your gift works for the charities that you've designated as part of that. What a lot of people do is they get friends and family involved in that charitable giving fund as well to be able to use that as their own private foundation to give to and get the tax benefits.
Thank you.
Cool.
I don't see anyone waving their hand. Oh, one more. Okay.
One very last one.
Yes.
Would you be able to summarize quickly the kind of fees that you charge, as you mentioned, on an annual basis versus what kind of fees are charged upon death?
Okay, so if you decide to appoint Solus Trust as your executor, there is no fee payable for that service while you're alive. When you pass on and we are still designated as your primary executor and then start acting in that capacity, we get paid out of the estate, and that's on a sliding scale determined by the value of the estate. So I can give you an example. If the estate consists of a $3 million portfolio, which consists of real estate, investments, bank accounts, etc., our fee on that would roughly be about 1.8%. So we are extremely competitive from a fee perspective, acting as an executor. The reason for that is our trust company was put into place to be an ancillary service to the advisors to be able to provide this full service of wealth planning. So looking at financial planning, investment management, insurance, tax, estate and trust, and then charitable giving. It's never the intention to become this big bad trust company to make a lot of money. If we then act as trustee for any future trusts that emanate out of the estate, so a testamentary trust, for instance, established for a spendthrift beneficiary or children, then our fees would roughly be 0.5% per annum on the value of those assets held in trust. But again, so there's no fees payable up front. If we get appointed and the day before you die, you update your will and you appoint somebody else, it was very nice to have the discussion with you, but we will never get paid. That's the nature of trust companies.
Great. I'm going to call it there. And Riann, we know that Halloween just happened 2 nights ago, so your family may be overdosed on chocolate. But if not, you can save it for a little while. We're very grateful. And there may be other questions that people want to approach you after our conversation. But thank you very much. We know this is a Sunday afternoon, and we know this is your business, but we're very grateful that you've taken the time to be with us. So please, thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Last question was my husband, so I had to allow that.
That was such a good question. You may get a couple of points after this.
Amazing.
I know that's not the purpose. No.